So Penn State sustainability is aligned with the United Nations 17 Goals of Sustainability, which is the handout that you have. And White Pine Center also aligns with that, realizing that everything is interconnected. And all these things that influence us throughout our lives definitely influence everything around us. Katie?
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I see.
See,
Slippy sticky tack. It's always dangerous.
there you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. So as Mary mentioned, I'm with Penn State Sustainability. I'm based here in Northwest PA, but we as a unit work out of the University Park campus, but a couple of us work remotely. So I'm in Northwest PA, one of my colleagues is in Philadelphia, and we kind of divided the 24 Commonwealth campuses in a way. And we are in touch with a lot of the Commonwealth campuses and the communities in which they are placed to have a better sense of what's happening on the ground there, to recognize very clearly that the University Park campus is its own country, frankly. And so to try to really have a sense of how our organization can help the Commonwealth broadly and the state broadly. But we do, as Mary mentioned, we do think of sustainability very, very broadly. So a lot of times when we first encounter the word sustainability, we automatically think of things like recycling, and that's important. We need true, good effort in waste and recycling, and so that is definitely not something that we cast aside. But there's so much more, as the Sustainable Development Goals spell out, so much more that falls under the umbrella of sustainability. And if you look at those 17 goals, really only about 4 of them are strictly environmentally focused. So that's the framework that we work within, and that's also the way in which I think we can see a lot of connections with something like body image and disordered eating, and the ways that people feel in the world and whether or not they feel okay in the world, because that's a lot of what we're talking about, whether they feel okay and welcomed and like they belong. So at Penn State Sustainability, our definition of sustainability is the simultaneous pursuit of human health and happiness, environmental quality, and economic well-being for current and future generations. So the first thing is human health and happiness. That is what we take first, because another aspect of this that I think a lot of us can relate to is a lot of times when you think of sustainability, you think of kind of draconian measures that have to happen in order for us to keep going in the world, and that's just not true at all. And also, we like the way that this really centers that something to be sustainable means it has to be sustainable for everyone. And so this is a lot of what I think we'll come back to today. So I initially was based at Penn State Barron, and that's where I met Mary back in 2019. I was on the campus's eating disorder support team, and she came in and talked to us about White Pine, and it was like, oh my God, this is so exciting, because I knew from personal experience growing up and from friends that this was a huge need in our area. And so I am really, really grateful to still be connected with her and to be connected with this organization. And I think that there's just a lot of work to be done here. And the classes that she was referencing, the class and the intern, the student, the honor student that she was referencing, were connected by my colleague at Penn State Sustainability, Alona Balrich, who runs the Sustainable Communities Collaborative. And this is an entity that works with nonprofits and municipalities and sometimes businesses. It really is a lot of the arm of fulfilling the land grant mission, which is part of our big mission as Penn State, and working within communities across the state. So sometimes we partner faculty from Commonwealth campuses with the communities, but sometimes there's just so many different types of subjects at University Park campus. Sometimes those faculty will partner their classes with entities throughout the state. So that's how that's been working. And I do want to say that I'm really encouraged by this. And one of the reasons is that body image is not intuitively for a lot of people a sustainability issue. It doesn't automatically fit for a lot of people when they even think of, even if they're looking at the goals, it's not necessarily automatic, because I think we often have a sense that body image is this very narrow thing, that it's about vanity, it's about the way you look, and then that's it, end of story. And I think that's one of the really important pieces of work to do, is to help people understand that this is so much more than just how you feel, like how you feel in the world. And so I do have a definition that I found in some of the research I was going through. Body image is not only related to the way people perceive their body, but it also influences the way they interact with the world through that body. And I would say it also influences the way the world interacts with them through that body. And that's maybe the most important part, because we're constantly getting feedback, and we know the codes that we are to adhere to culturally. And if we're talking about something that makes it so that our way of being does not align with those codes, then that's where we have a justice issue, a social justice issue. That's where we have inequality. That's where we have the kinds of things that we'll talk about, but that Mary also started to mention, where you've got students not showing up to classes, you've got people not getting promoted, really major issues, just because of the way they present in the world. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's often thought of too, even if it is understood to be more than just how you're perceiving yourself, it's often narrowed to like slenderness. But there's also issues of colorism, the shades of people's skin, even within, it's not even just race that they are, but the shade that their skin is. And also ableism, how able-bodied they are, what kind of access they have to things, or what kind of expectations the world is placing on them, and what kind of limitations that they're facing because of that. So all of this is going to influence, obviously, body image. Ageism is another one, and while we're talking a lot today about, the way adolescents are affected by this, if you're an adolescent and you're looking at somebody, you're being taught to look at somebody older as something you definitely don't want to become, that is going to make you terrified to grow up. And I think, that there's just this, there's a lot embedded in this that often we have to kind of pull apart to see. So if you have a better image of yourself, a couple of these we also mentioned, but I have a list. If you have a better image of yourself, you'll be more likely to stay in school, avoid harmful relationships, and seek out positive ones. Aim toward your potential, not just say, well, I'm not good enough for that. Avoid risky behaviors, whether they're self-harm, violence, unprotected sex, overspending, which is one can be very, very harmful if you're being influenced to purchase things to try to fix yourself all the time. And you'll also be more likely to engage in civic participation. You'll care, as Mary was talking about, you'll care about yourself, and therefore you care more about the world around you. And you will believe that you have a role to play, and that you have influence. And you'll also not fall prey to harmful diet and wellness marketing, which is everywhere. And this is really somewhere I think that it can, another one, we can kind of get caught up in just thinking, oh, that's just a shallow thing. But I want to read a definition of, you may have heard the term diet culture. This is around these days. The term diet culture is getting thrown around a lot. And there's one registered dietitian and public health thinker and clinician and all sorts of things named Christy Harrison, who I think has a really helpful definition of this, so I'm just going to read it. Diet culture is a system of beliefs that worships thinness and equates it to health and moral virtue, which means you can spend your whole life thinking you're irreparably broken just because you don't look like the impossibly thin ideal. Diet culture promotes weight loss as a means of attaining higher status, which means you feel compelled to spend a massive amount of time, energy, and money trying to shrink your body, even though the research is very clear that almost no one can sustain intentional weight loss for more than a few years. Diet culture demonizes certain ways of eating while elevating others. This one I'm going to come back to in a moment. Which means you're forced to be hyper-vigilant about your eating, ashamed of making certain food choices, and distracted from your pleasure, your purpose, and your power. And diet culture also oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of health, which disproportionately harms women, trans folks, people in larger bodies, people of color, people with disabilities, damaging both their mental and physical health. So when we laminate some of that thinking on top of the way that it is to be in the world, of course we've got so many influences from so many places, and a lot of people moving in a very fast pace and maybe not being taught to critically think things through or to discriminate. This is valuable, this is harmful. We're talking about incredibly vulnerable populations. We're talking about what is a major global mental health concern, which is what I've seen. This was an article from February of 2023 that I found, and it's just called Body Image as a Global Mental Health Concern. And it really takes apart some of the ways in which this is much deeper than I think a lot of us have been taught to think of it. Or maybe even in the way that it has been looked at in a lot of arenas. So now we're really talking about, if we think about the sustainable development goals that you have in front of us, we're really talking about a lot of ways in which this aligns. So I want to look at the sustainable development goals for a moment and just kind of pull some of them apart. And then I'm going to share a couple of examples of the ways that I've seen this play out in people I've interacted with. Particularly college students. I mean, the definition of adolescence actually incorporates the beginning of college, and young people incorporates even more. This is a WHO definition, goes all the way to 24. So we're talking about, a pretty inclusive lifespan. And some of us still feel like adolescents in many ways. I know some days I wake up and I think, I just can't today, It's that kind of feeling. So if we look at the sustainable development goals that you have in front of you, some of these are really obvious, but I'll just talk about a few anyway. So no poverty at the top. If we think about that in terms of body image, there's a term I've seen called body capital. So that's basically the wealth, like you've heard maybe the term social capital, and it's the kind of wealth that you have because of your body. So some bodies are financially rewarded, as we've mentioned, things like promotions, etc. And some bodies are financially strapped. They're sold products and methods to change. So this is a very, very simple baseline thinking of this. But if we think about the ways in which people's vulnerabilities are preyed upon, and the way that certain communities are targeted and are taught to believe that they need to change something or they're never going to get ahead, we're talking about a pretty major issue. And that's global. In other cultures, maybe it is colors, maybe it's the skin tone. There's a lot of money being exchanged to lighten skin. And in other cultures, it's weight loss or reshaping or plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery, which is huge globally now in very young ages. So that's one thing I think. And I came across I think could be really interesting for Erie in particular, where we have still, I believe, around 20% immigrant and refugee population. I found this in some research. It said immigration from a lower income and less westernized area to a higher income, urban, and westernized area is frequently accompanied by increased body image concerns and a loss of capital that may lead to body capital becoming more salient. So if you're really trying to assimilate, that's this added layer of needing to strive in a way that is very often unattainable. So the next one that we have listed there is zero hunger. This is another one that may seem really obvious, but just a few examples. And to break this down, the targets are end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition. Food insecurity is prevalent in Erie. Most of us probably know this. And there are many assumptions. Maybe some of you encountered these, I definitely have. Many assumptions that food insecure equals thin. I even talked to, there was a healthcare provider I talked to a few years ago about putting food insecurity screenings in their office. And their response was, well, we do screen. You know, if they're underweight, of course we screen. Oh, not at all understanding the way that food insecurity presents. And this, you know, intuitively you might think, well, they don't have as much food, they're going to be in a smaller body. Not at all true. And the research bears this out a lot now. There's a lot of associations between food insecurity and disordered eating patterns. And there's also just a lot to be said for food insecurity being associated with poor body image. There is a lot more research underway. This is one of those things where I saw people like, more research is needed. But even in the last 5 years, you do see a lot more associations between food insecurity and disordered eating patterns, whether or not they're clinically named eating disorders. So the thing is, there's a lot of shame involved in being poor and being food insecure. And there's a lot of shame involved in having a body that doesn't fit. And if you have any experience with shame, you know that it's a paralyzing mental health. It's a state of mind. It's a paralyzing emotion. And so, you know, we know that it's also going to be a source of preoccupation. We know that it's going to take students out of paying attention, being able to pay attention in class. We know that food insecurity alone is going to create huge problems for their learning, which then, of course, sets them up to economic disparities later in life and on a long path that we don't want them on. Good health and well-being. This one's probably our most obvious. And it breaks down, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all, at all ages. Consistent findings, this is a quote from research as well, consistent findings regarding the association between body image and multiple indicators of poor mental health, including eating disorders, mood disorders, and general impaired functioning, highlight the critical nature of body image concerns. Coordinated efforts should be made to address this global issue. So that was from the title that I read to you that I found from February of 2023. So a lot of this research is pretty emergent, which is, it's great. We have a lot of work to do. But you know, good health and well-being it's not real hard to make a lot of myriad connections between the ways in which body image is going to challenge that, if it's a poor body image. And also that helps us to think again of the messages that a lot of, especially young people, are getting about how they need to, especially with the wellness, quote unquote, wellness, a lot of very bad advice about nutrition. There's just messy stuff out there. And so if they are feeling that poor body image, they're much more susceptible to that stuff. I'm not going to go through all 17 of these, just by the way. We're like, oh my God. But I will hit on a few more. Quality education, the target for that is ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education. I was reading the prior one. So again, we talked about absenteeism. There's study bearing out that body image issues, if they are especially in people with higher weight bodies, they're less likely to obtain a college degree. Not that you have to, but we do know that earning-wise, that often, you know, over a lifespan, it often means higher earning. And it also is going to mean, like I was mentioning earlier, the preoccupation in classes. And then there's, of course, the weight stigma that comes from this, from fellow students, sometimes from teachers inadvertently. You know, a lot of this stuff comes out because it's again, like that diet culture. It's the water we're swimming in. So it's often very hard to tease out the messages that are going to be problematic until we really start to look at them and think about, like, is this gonna, how would I feel if somebody said this? How would this make me feel? So there's also, I think this is where a lot comes into with, oh, I'm just concerned with their health. And that's an interesting area to work in. As we know, bodies can be healthy at different sizes. And we don't know how they got to the size that they are. Was it in a healthy way? Or is there something very dangerous going on? There's a lot of things at play there. So that's where we have, I feel like, a lot of room for education and awareness, just understanding, okay, like, is this something we should even be talking about? Bodies, how can we work with this? Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to stir up a hornet's nest, but when I look at mental health in general, talking body image, body positivity, I think whether you're male, female, it comes down to the people closest to you. It's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunts, and uncles that put those stigmas in our head, and they put you in a position where through your life you're trying to make that person of authority happy.
Well, I mean, it's not an absolute no. It's one of the ways in which people get these messages, but I think one thing that can be really helpful is to remember that they got those messages from somebody too.
Right.
You know, they're these conduits. And I think that's where rethinking it as diet culture instead of it's these people that I'm going to blame because I have this idea in my head now. You know, if it's your culture, it's very hard to separate yourself and understand exactly where the influence came from.
But it takes multiple generations, you know, decades to change that home dynamic.
It does, but I think we're from when I was that age, we've made enormous progress.
Well, and I agree.
Yeah,
you know.
but we do have a long way to go. But exactly right, and I think that's where a lot of things where people start interventions in schools that are very positive. If they are done in the right way, then they can have that very positive influence on the whole family. If they're done with that sensitivity, you know, as an example, what White Pine does. But I also know that there are ways in which there can be, and I'll share an example about this in a moment, where there can be that danger of blaming and shaming those in the household who are in power. So for instance, I'll just share this example now. So I went to, there was a conversation, it was a whole conference about kids in schools and food stuff and like food system stuff and kids in schools and everything. And one of the presentations was by a group that goes and speaks to, they work in school gardens with students, and they speak about healthy eating, and they also speak about carbon footprint of foods. So they were presenting a lesson that they take to the groups that they teach, and they're working with adolescents. They're working with especially like younger adolescents. So they were doing this lesson on a carbon footprint of a cheeseburger. So they kind of took apart, like, here's this, and they asked the kids, and they're teaching us how to do this. Like, so here's this bun. What do you think the carbon footprint is of this bun? And like, here's a tomato. What do you think the carbon footprint is of this? And okay, now we're gonna get to the beef. Now, what's the carbon footprint of this? And basically, they had a very rudimentary set of numbers that wasn't wrong, but it was certainly incomplete. You know, and I'm thinking, like, where did the beef come from? Was it industrial farming, or was it your cow out back? Was the tomato something you grew, or was it, you know, on like this mass, where did it get shipped from? All of these things were not broken down. So that was one thing. It was like, okay, we need to maybe do. The one thing that they said that made me a little bit nervous was they were talking about how their experience of the kids, then they would see the kids again, they would do another lesson. And the kids come back to us, they said. The kids come back to us and they say, oh, I went home and I told my mom, and then she was gonna serve us that, but then she didn't. And I'm thinking, Oh, okay. Wait a minute though. Did you just like, or I didn't eat it then because I knew that it had a high carbon footprint. And it's like, okay, so mom or whomever, or whoever I should say, mom or whoever prepared a meal. We don't know what that took, you know, whatever guardian was, what that took to get the meal in front of the child. We don't know if that was maybe the very end of the resources, and now we're telling the child, if you eat this, you're hurting the planet? And then suddenly, we're kind of exploiting a child to influence an adult who is the one who's actually making the grocery purchases and who knows the actual economic reality and the access issues. You know, maybe that's what they can get where they are, and that's what they can afford. And they know if they put that in front of the child, it's going to fill the child up for a long time. And no, it's not perfect. And yes, we know there are certainly better things to eat than cheeseburgers. But this is where I think it can get really, really challenging. Is like you get these messages coming in, and children, you know, and young adolescents are very black and white. It's like, okay, I thought that was good. Now I know it's bad. I will never touch it again. Okay, and you know, to maybe they're refusing food because they have learned that this is a problem. And so that's where when I think about the way that the influence comes down, it seems so important to be very sensitive. And I think also when you think about like any kind of messaging around body image too, it's just where is this going to land if you're telling, you know, especially there's a lot of schools doing perhaps not entirely interrogated work around quote unquote obesity. I say quote unquote because that's a challenging term for a lot of people. There's a lot of stuff that gets out there, and I think it can be very easy to then make the leap like, oh well, then it's the parent or guardian's fault, or there's really no blame, I think, in any of this stuff. We're in a landscape where it's very hard to access, for a lot of people, it's very hard to access the right, quote unquote, again, the ideal kinds of foods. Maybe it's not even their culture. Our notion of what healthy eating is very Eurocentric. And so, you know, maybe grandma makes some incredible thing, has made it it's the tradition, but they're being told in school, well, that's not healthy. And it's like, okay, we have just pulled the child out of a cultural rootedness because we are trying to do this lesson. So I think it's a really thorny area. I mean, that's all I'll say is like, I don't have any answers about all of that. I just think that this is where a lot of the messages around sustainability, sustainable eating for the planet can be very complicated. We don't know who's hearing these messages or what their life circumstances are, and all of us know that no matter how well you try to align with your ethic, we live in a landscape that makes that very hard. We live in a world that makes that very challenging. So that's where, I don't know, is there anything else you want to say about that? Was a kind of like a long turn I took there.
No, that's okay. You know, I just, like I said, when I look at overall mental health, a lot of the damage happens in the home. You know, if you're a little bit heavy and you get positive reinforcement, you're raised with body positivity. If in that same household you're told, wow, your pants are getting a little tight, you've just put that person in a position where they don't feel as good as they did when they put those pants on.
There is definitely that level of, you know, where we can all try to learn to be much more sensitive about how to, you know, where it's appropriate or not appropriate or useful to comment on bodies, for sure. I actually don't use the term body positivity because that's, to me, too high a reach. I like neutrality. I like that, okay, let's just not get too crazy about it today. You know?
Are you comfortable? Do you like the way you look?
Yeah.
Move on.
What's your body able to do? You know, keep centering it more too, and like, what are you able to do? And if if there are ability limitations, still, what are you able to do though? You know, keep the focus on what is possible. What can you sense? what are you in, what's around you? It's just this, it's just this suit of flesh when you really get down to it, but it's capable of incredible things regardless of where its limitations are. And yeah, I think though, again, like it's true that a lot of these messages do originate with those very close to us, but they also are situated in a culture that reinforces them. And so I think that's where we really have to kind of keep it, the changes that we need to make are much more at the cultural level and then at the policy level, and where can we really make sure that there's a much broader understanding of this. I think that's the way I would think about it. So I know we're getting to, I don't want to go on and on, but we can talk about a few of these. I almost see connections to body image with all of the sustainable development goals. I mean, so a couple of them are a stretch. But when you think about even things that are not maybe automatically obvious, like for instance, number 12, responsible consumption and production. Responsible really needs to mean not driving unnecessary consumption of products purchased to ameliorate poor body image, and also helping adolescents to especially distinguish between pseudoscience and wellness when it's truly necessary. So there is that kind of it's all that critical thinking. We don't even have to talk about body with them, which can be a very triggering subject depending on their experience. Just talk about what's real, how do you do this, how do you figure out what is worth paying attention to? And also build up that sense of self that is much broader than just how you appear to the world. And they're going to be able to, take a lot of that stuff in stride in a much different way. Others that I just highlighted, I won't go through, and maybe we can talk if there's a little extra time, but there's a couple other things I wanted to hit on. Gender equality is a big one with this. We know there's a much better understanding, there's starting to be a much better understanding of how broadly this affects. It's not used to be thought of as just a girl problem, but we still have proportions that seem to lean towards certain genders or gender presentations. And so that is a really big one where we need to think about in terms of how can body image speak to this. Decent work and economic growth, we've always talked about that. Reduced inequality in general. We talked about some of the assumptions around that. But the last one that I want to share another example before I just pause for some questions so we're not here for the rest of our lives. Climate action. May not seem automatic, but this is where I want to share another example, because I think that often when people think of climate action, they feel very helpless and overwhelmed. And you often see, oh, but you can make decisions 3 times a day with what you eat. And that's a yes and. Maybe you can also. I want to share an example. I had a student I worked with when I was working on sustainable food systems a few years ago, and she came to me and I knew she was her background. I knew her background a little bit because I had gone and talked about disordered eating to a group of students, and so she came up to me afterwards and shared a little bit about her background. But then she was interested very much in sustainable food systems. So she said, I see how important this all is. I feel like this is where I can make a difference, this is something I can do. I can eat to save the planet. I mean, it's that big, a lot of thinking. But she was a college student. Her resources in terms of the amount of money she had were very low. She had learned the very strict thinking about what does and does not make a harmful diet. So there were a lot of foods that she was refusing to eat because of that. So not only did she have very few resources in terms of the financial, her access was very limited because she was on a college campus. There were not a lot of grocery stores around, and for a while she didn't have a car. And also, when she started, she was in the dining hall. So while dining halls are doing a great job of trying to meet students' needs now, and boy, do they have their hands full, she really didn't have a lot of choices. So she just stopped eating. She had a history of anorexia, and she had gotten through that. She'd gotten really good help. She thought kind of even beyond recovery. You know, it's always in there. But she felt very strong. This kicked it right back into gear for her. And then it had an added impetus of the entire world. You're not doing this just for yourself and so that you'll feel your version of safe in the world. But if you eat that thing, you're harming these creatures, or you're harming this part of the environment, or you're harming whatever. So that's a lot to put on people's shoulders. I wish I could tell you that I encounter that very rarely, but I don't. And I think that that's a really important thing. I even came across in a book by an activist and writer and scholar named Sarah Jaquette Ray, who wrote a book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And one of her students, one of her students, this is a quote from the book, at a grocery store, when she could not decide on a purchase that would not somehow, this is a quote from the student, would not somehow contribute to ecological, social, and personal health problems, she would leave without food altogether, deciding it was better to go hungry than to make the wrong decision. The student thought that to disappear, to become smaller, was to be beautiful, and of course a good environmentalist. So this is where I really think a major connection between body image and sustainability is. When you think of like a good environmentalist or a sustainable person, you often think of a certain body type, and they might look a certain way. I'm projecting on you. It may not be the case for you, and if it's not, please don't take this on. But I think a lot of us have a picture in our minds. And in a lot of senses, that is someone with unbelievable willpower and ability to restrain and some kind of righteousness that allows them to make all their decisions based on how they're going to impact the whole world. The problem with that is manifold. But one of it is that they have taken themselves out of the equation in terms of how to be sustainable. Because in many cases, and we see this a lot, there are a lot of associations being drawn between certain types of diets that are planet-saving diets, that are good diets for the planet, and eating disorders. This is a very, there's a lot of correlations being drawn. And to the point where they're almost like risk factors for certain people. So, this is where I think a lot of times when you're talking about having a healthy body image, it has to also incorporate valuing yourself enough to recognize that you too are worth sustaining. And you don't have to be nihilistic, and you don't have to waste away. And you don't have to prove to anybody how little you need and how little of an impact you're having. While this is all admirable theoretically, it's really harmful when it plays out, especially again when we're talking about the age groups that tend to be very binary, black and white thinking, and also seeking identities. And you think about how identity is now, it's not I am someone who eats a vegetarian diet. It's I am vegetarian, It's like you're saying whatever other association, it becomes an identity. And that's where I think a lot of real careful nuance needs to come in to the conversations that we have around sustainability in the future and the way those messages get across. Because they could be being heard in a very, very black and white kind of way, and they could be harming people. So that's a really, I think, important point to make. I have enough notes here for the rest of our lives, as I said, but I'm going to stop and just say what we can do is really work to see body image as greater than a superficial vanity problem that only affects a few certain adolescents. We can model body satisfaction. I like that, like satisfaction, okay. That's good. Positivity. satisfaction and body neutrality, and don't talk about bodies in negative ways. That's so habitual. It's so part of our culture. Just don't do it. You know, that's a great thing to try to cut out of your life. That's a good thing to diet from. Separate messages of sustainability from body shape or ability, and avoid creating these moral hierarchies, like, oh, if you only eat this, then you're better than someone over here who's eating this. You don't know why they're eating that and why you're not. I mean, there's just so many layers to everybody. And then just strive to create intentionally inclusive, body diverse environments that don't have those hierarchies in place. And I think we're on our way. I think there's a lot, as Jenny was mentioning, there's a lot of really great influencer messages. There's also terrible ones, but there are a lot of great ones. And I think that, you know, if we can start to help amplify more of those voices, and help get a lot of this more nuanced thinking out, then we're going to be in much better shape. Better shape. So I'm open to questions, thoughts, anything at all. Keep in mind that I'm not a researcher in this, but so there may be things I will just say, we don't know. But I'll look it up for you if I don't know. Any thoughts?
Katie, I was just really taken by your comment there at the end that the way that you said it is really the end game, is you too are worth sustaining.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's I think the missing link for so many people. We have all these lists
Right.
of things we're supposed to do and things we're not supposed to do, things that are moral and ethical, and we have to take care of this and this and this and this. Well, we're worth taking care of also.
Right.
You know?
And also just helping to model that that is not selfish. That is, you know, it's the oft used image of you put your own mask on first. and that, you know, in order for us to have the vitality and the interest to engage in the world in a positive way, we gotta do things that sustain us, and that may be making changes in our own choices that don't align perfectly with whatever kind of ethic or whatever our friends are doing, whatever our peer group is telling us is the ideal. And yeah, just really making those choices for ourselves.
One thing that I've been reflecting on, I visited Japan late last year, and in collectivist societies, more so than our own, there's this odd give and take where a lot of societal expectations are built on shame, and this collective shame that's sort of an undercurrent, even if it's not explicitly said. And the benefit of kind of egalitarian democratic societies is maybe that's not the foundation of your society, but then you have to sort of ask yourself what is, and what is helping to balance expectation and collective good against convenience. I think in our case it's sort of the reverse of that. And I struggle with that a lot in terms of how do we find a balance back to some sort of healthy status quo.
Yeah.
Because convenience feels to be so much taking over our life, but we also don't want collective shame
Right.
as the motivator for why
Right.
we're taking action. So I just mull over that so often, like what is the midpoint? What is the goal? What are we trying to reach?
Yeah.
And I liked the comments about sort of the social structure and acknowledging that our early years are so fundamental to our development and the way that we see the world, and I totally agree with that. So how do you at a very early age create a sense of community and acceptance?
Yeah. I really
Not a
appreciate.
question, not.
No, I
just
really
my
appreciate
comments.
you brought that up, because it also highlights the fact that our perception of certain emotions is cultural as well. And that, you know, shame, I automatically was like, shame is paralyzing, but it's not. In other cultures, it can be it's just a part of what motivates good action. I think I would love to, I'm gonna be mulling that over as well now, so thank you. But I think, yeah, like the emphasis on the word collectivist is a lot of where we get so lost. And well, that's one of the things that I love about digging in with students or anyone on food choices, because you can help people see that, or whether maybe it's clothing choices, whatever it is, the choices that you're making are affecting these people everywhere, and these, of course, these landscapes, but also just other human lives. And so I certainly don't want to be dismissive of the vote with your fork kind of notion, or the idea that you have choices to make 3 times a day. I think where it gets so complicated is that it's not a level playing field. And so if we all had the same choices that we could be making, then certainly things would be different. But that is a really interesting thing to think about, the way that shame can be a motivator in other places. And I'm sure that some of us, maybe have been able to use it that way as well. I shouldn't generalize. I have found it paralyzing, but that doesn't mean that everybody does, and it certainly is a teacher. It certainly is like, oh. But guilt, I think, is a different thing too. Like, guilt is a much more like, oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that. It's not, oh, I'm a horrible person because I did that. And that's where I think too, like, especially in adolescence, when there's that black and white, like, oh, it just becomes a personal, like, oh, I'm horrible because I did that, instead of, oh, I wish I'm going to make a different change, or make a different choice next time. Yeah, that's a really good thought, though. Yeah.
You focused a lot on food, but it's I think if they make their decisions along everything, again, when you say sustainability, you're thinking, oh, just recycling or whatever, but like, I'm thinking the choices of clothes, the choices of any purchases, the choices of all of the choices. So that, I don't know how to phrase it, but like, I really enjoyed everything you said, and it brought new light into the way I think of some of these areas. And then, like, with the parents and the culture, I was in education, and when you have early intervention or a child with special needs, it's not just educating the child. You come in and educate the parents and give the parents advice. And if we had a little bit more of that, when we become parents, they're like, here's your child.
Yeah. Good luck.
That, then as a culture, if we had a little bit more intervention at the beginning,
Right.
then you wouldn't always just fall back on what you were taught. That you can learn something new.
Yeah, and I think that's where, I appreciate you saying that, and I think that's where, what Mary was saying earlier about the way that this stuff presents across the lifespan. I mean, when we're healing, when we're healing one generation, it's very likely that we have the potential to heal multiple generations. But the way to do that is not to put it on the shoulders of the 10-year-old, And I think that's where some of the messages around, oh, eat healthier in your household. It's like, what? Well, I don't think that that's wrong. I certainly don't think it's wrong to expose kids to wonderful, opportunities to grow and to eat brilliant vegetables and other things. But it's one of those areas where you can see, like, we could be running into.
You have a family night at the school so that everyone is involved.
Yeah, and we have some great examples of that kind of stuff. The Erie School District has some really wonderful work, of course, around that. We're so lucky to have that example. And it's just a matter of, like, making sure that is that comprehensive understanding. But you brought up clothing. I didn't really talk too much about clothing, but that's another area that I think is intriguing, because some of the I'm wearing secondhand. This is very deliberate. I'm wearing secondhand clothing tonight. But that's one of the messages that you see when it's like another one of those messages about here's how to save the planet. Wear secondhand clothing, buy brands that are using fabrics like wool and silk, natural fabrics and everything. Again, we're talking about a limited access thing. For one thing, if you're shopping at Eileen Fisher, you're maybe buying one thing for life. That's, I mean, like the prices, and they reflect, you know, on one hand, I don't want to be too critical because in a lot of cases, prices of natural fabrics are often reflective of what they actually cost to create. Especially if you're talking about people who are paid a sustainable wage to create them. But when you talk about like I think the quote unquote low-hanging fruit that often is proliferated is buy secondhand clothing, which is great. But the clothing industry and manufacturers already have a problem with size range. So when you're talking about secondhand clothing, that's an even narrower field of accessibility. And if you are a little bit concerned in terms of like maybe you don't have a really strong sense of body image, or maybe you're just not having a great day, and you go to the thrifty shopper, you're not finding your sizes, you leave with nothing, or you leave with like one thing that doesn't actually go with anything else in your wardrobe. There's a lot there. And so, I mean, there are these, and that's an issue of the industry. You know, they're not making clothing to fit the people in the world. And then you have these size discrepancies, which are outrageous, where you can't count on being the same size, and it works on you. So I'm just glad you brought that up, and I think that's another way in which clothing so often represents who we want to be in the world, and it can carry a lot more. It can come off initially as a superficial thing, but we all know that it's a lot deeper than that, and it's how we are then perceived by others. And so there's a lot to that one. So yeah, thank you for mentioning it.
It's all my daughter's in Florida, so like we're mailing stuff there like crazy. Just
Did she get?
oh, she's okay, but
Okay.
you have that survivor's guilt of
Yeah.
the people around you, so you wanna help, you know. So
Yeah.
Man.
she's reaching out to her church, so like we're mailing and donating stuff so she
Yeah.
can bring it to the church and they can help others.
Oh, that's really, I'm so glad that's happening. Oh my God, that extra layer of just, I can't imagine. Yeah. Any thoughts or anything?
I have a thought, I just don't know how I want to say it.
Shoot, I've been just standing up here and shooting.
I was thinking back to, you know, working and jobs and employers, and you mentioned how body image or a person's appearance can affect being hired, promotions, and you know, we've all heard that before.
Right.
And I'm looking at both, again, I don't know how to say this, but I'm looking at both sides of this. So you have a person who may go in for that interview or asking for a promotion, and they are not comfortable with themselves. How much of it is that, and how much of it is the employer that is biased? And then you get those two things together, and it goes nowhere.
Right.
Again, I don't know, I don't have an answer for that, I'm just saying your identity and how you feel and your confidence can come through,
Of course.
but then you're still fighting against this, so it's just both ways, it comes from both ends,
Yeah.
I believe.
Well, it's gonna
Yeah.
vary in every situation. You know, if you had a lousy interviewee before this person came in, you're in a bad mood.
Yeah, it could
Oh,
be,
yeah.
could be
Yeah.
rooted
From
in
person to
anything.
person, from day to day.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I think, you know, you're naming again that situation where it's in our culture so much. So
Right,
It's like,
yeah, that's what yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's
So
very
you
hard.
can do I mean, we all have a responsibility to do our best and to bring good into the world, you know, but you can be confident in yourself and do this, and you're still fighting against this, so
Yep.
it's gonna take just a lot.
Yeah, the taproot goes a lot deeper than any of us have been able to dig it out on our own.
Right.
And I think that's where it could get to a sense of real overwhelm if we start to realize how deeply it goes.
Right, yeah.
And also I think that's where, you know, conversations like this
Mhm.
and interventions like what White Pine does, and you know, it's like it's just trickling it out.
And that's what I was thinking too, because you mentioned about in families and one, like you said, one way to assist with that is going into the schools and helping the children, changing the dialogue when they're young.
Right.
But doing it the right way. It's just gonna start, it has a lot more to go.
Yeah, yeah. And often we see culturally, that could be like, oh my God, when are we ever gonna get there? But often culturally, we have those phenomena known as tipping points, and it'll just be like, this isn't going, this isn't going, it's not. And then the Berlin Wall is gone, and it's like, oh, okay. People were pushing on it for decades, but it just felt like overnight, okay.
And then I would assume one tipping point was COVID.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, that's,
I mean,
we're not gonna understand the results of that
For years.
in our lifetimes. I think, yeah, that's gonna be
I'm
deep.
almost to pre-COVID pants.
Yeah.
Sweatpants became my friend.
As they should be.
Yeah.
As they should be.
You know, one thing that, Angie, what you were saying made me think about is in our statement of, equal opportunity, everybody has their statement, da-da-da-da. We include body shape and size, which almost nobody does.
No.
And that should be in everybody's
It needs to be
equal
codified.
opportunity statement.
Yeah,
It's a very good point.
there are.
And there are no legal protections.
No.
I mean, there's legal protection, and that's a real slippery slope.
Sure.
I get that, that's very messy, but there are really legal protections against a lot of these other categories,
Yeah.
that we give equal opportunity to. There are no protections
Right.
against any of that.
That's where it kind of goes to the opposite side, where the employment world, and there needs to be some change on that level.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, and at the policy level, there's certain, I can't remember where, but certain places have actually, is it New York City is one of the places, and then maybe a state have put that into like their broader policy.
Mhm.
Don't
Yeah,
quote me on that,
yeah.
the camera is still running.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it can be enacted beyond even just, but organization by organization is an even easier way to do it.
And I don't think we'll see this in our lifetime, but when I'm working with a client, I have a fiduciary responsibility to provide them a range of options that are most aligned with their goals and their personal attributes. I can be fined, I can end up in jail depending on how grossly negligent I am. The only way we're gonna get beyond what she's talking about is to hold hiring managers and promoting managers to that standard.
And I think that's, if we're starting to think,
Defend it in court.
yeah,
If I'm promoting this person over this person,
right,
and you can find grounds that you were a better candidate, you should be able to sue.
right,
Move on.
yeah.
$1 million fine to that company, they won't do it twice.
And that's where something we could have an effect on the local level. That's something we could enact, whether it's an organization that we're part of, or whether it's a municipality that we're part of.
Nobody wants to vote no on that law and then try to run for re-election.
Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah, and I think a lot of that too is, there's a lot of things that once people hear them, that they think, oh, well, of course that should be in place, but, or assume that it is, and it's not, and so, yeah, that's another thing we can have conversations around, where we really can enact change. Yeah,
Just because you change the law doesn't mean though that you can afford going into time and money to go to court.
Well,
that's very true.
Because I know people that have had prejudice against them and they just didn't have the time or the money to fight it.
Yeah, that is probably inevitable.
I think you have to look at it as a step in culture change.
Right.
It's nothing more than a step. It can be a big step, possibly, but it's a step.
Yeah, I think that you're right though, there's always gonna be
Yeah.
that challenge, but if more people see that in writing, then there's still has potential to, trickle out other places and.
You take a small business owner, let's say they've got like 10 employees. They're wanting to provide medical coverage to their employees free of charge. It's a wonderful thing. But if I take somebody with significant medical challenges and I bring them in, I'm gonna pay higher premiums. That is absolutely on their mind when you're looking at, because in a small company, you're not being pulled together and based on a demographic.
Right.
Every individual is being graded individually and rated.
And this is where the education has to land on helping people understand that their body size does not equal health or lack of health. And that's where I think there's a lot of good conversation around that happening, but that is so ingrained in our culture. And we have the research, it's still like there's almost day after day, it seems like there's more research emerging that tries to break that automatic correlation that people are making. This is not to say that there aren't risk factors associated with certain body sizes at a population level. But the fact that there's so much assumption about someone's health, I think that's a real problem. And I know, for instance, I'll use a very personal, I'll self-disclose here. I got into this because this was a lot of my history, obsession with food and eating and disordered pathology and all of that stuff. And there were times in my life when my behaviors were incredibly unhealthy, and my doctor said, just keep doing what you're doing, because I was the size that they thought I should be. I would have been much healthier at a different size, but I think that's one of those things that speaks to the ingrained assumptions around somebody's size of their body. And so that's where we really have to do the educating, like help people disentangle all of that weight, all that health assumption from the size of a body. Because you just don't know. You don't know what somebody's actual metrics are. You don't know what their day-to-day is like. What are they getting to do exercise-wise? What are they getting access to? What's their mental health like? Because we know that is such a huge factor in somebody's longevity and ability to survive. So, there's just, I think that's another area of education that we're starting to see more of. Starting. I really appreciate this conversation with you all. I really, I enjoyed putting it together and thinking about it, and I loved talking to you about it, so thank you for that opportunity. And thank you, of course, Mary, for welcoming.